Hello student teachers. This presentation is going to cover some elements of sheltered content instruction as presented in the first couple of chapters of Echeverria and Graves' Sheltered Content Instruction, and that connection with the ELL Shadowing protocol designed by Ivania Soto for the purposes of shadowing an ELL student. Our goal here is for you to become more comfortable and proficient in understanding the academic oral language needs of English language learners in your classrooms and your ability to work effectively with them. So the content objectives for this presentation are an overview of sheltered instruction. We'll explain what that is, become familiar with how language and sociocultural issues affect second language learning, review how context supports language and content learning, and use these concepts to inform the process of shadowing an ELL student and along with their service provider. Our language objectives are that we will be discussing the elements of second language learning as a group in seminar, that you will, in your school context, complete the ELL shadowing observation protocol, and then write up a reflection based on the elements of the shadowing protocol and how it will affect the choices you make in planning your instruction. So why are we doing this? Even now, today, and I looked back just recently at some census data and some reports, this is still happening, even though this is 10-year-old data. It's just a great graph. The LEP enrollment, the limited English proficient enrollment in our schools, is increasing and continues to increase in percentages throughout our school system. And it is our responsibility as teachers, of course, to work with these students and help them achieve and have access to the content and curriculum that we're providing to them. For a definition, the limited English proficient refers to any person age 5 and older who reported speaking English less than very well as classified by the U.S. Census Bureau. The term proficient refers to people who reported speaking English only or very well. So the underlying subtext of this is that if they don't speak English very well, that there is another language that is involved in their language use. And that's always determined by the school through a series of interviews and surveys. So how did this whole issue of bilingual and ELL education come into play in the United States? There were some earlier case studies, studies like Brown versus the Board of Education, but the really important one for our purposes was the Lau versus Nichols case, class action suit led by some families against this, some Chinese families against the San Francisco Unified School District. And basically what happened was that these were non-English speaking, Chinese speaking children, and they were in the public schools, and the public school says, here, we've got some lovely history textbooks for you. And they said, thank you very much, but we really can't read these. We do not have access to the curriculum equal to students that speak English and read English. And so it went up to the Supreme Court and came down with what was called the Lau remedies, and it identified different levels of English language proficiency. And they determined that children who do not speak English are entitled to equal access to the school's curriculum. And those Lau remedies then brought school districts to a point where they had to identify the level of learning of the English language learners in order to provide them adequate services to provide them equal access to the curriculum, which is what we do today with the access tests and WIDA. It is the law that we provide this support to the students and that we identify them even today. But their school districts are working they do a lot of different things to work around really lack of resources. So you become the resource for these students. You become the person who provides that extra support and assistance to them with all the other things you need to do in your classrooms. So this link will take you to the Lau remedies, and it will explain it more in detail for you. It is very interesting for those of you that are interested. So basically, the Lau remedies looks at bilingualism, how much students speak English versus another language. And we look at English language learning in the United States, not as English as a foreign language, but English as a second language, or in many cases, English as a third or fourth or fifth language. But for simplified purposes, we look at students. There are certain ways to look at students with different language proficiencies. Balanced bilingual means that a person has equal skills in English and one or more languages, so that they are equally fluent in any of those languages, including English. We also have newly arrived with adequate schooling. These are students that come from other countries that have been in school and are typically literate in their native languages, which we use the code L1, which is first language or home language. Monolingual means they speak one language, or they could speak many languages, but none of them are English. Students with limited formal schooling also come from other countries typically, or other language enclaves, and they are also monolingual in a language other than English, but they are pre-literate in their native language, which basically indicates that they are not able to read or write in their native language to any effective level. A limited bilingual is not strong in either first language or second language, L1 or L2. And an example I use often are the Navajo students that I worked with whose parents were not, one parent would speak English and one parent would speak Navajo, but neither of them were strong in either. And so the children were not strong in either language either. Or there was a Filipino and a Nupiaq family on the North Slope. And the same issue is that the child didn't speak either of the languages efficiently, and did not speak English efficiently. So they were, their bilingualism was limited in that respect. It did not mean that they were dumb or cognitively impaired in any way. They just didn't have a strong language. And so what we end up doing in our classrooms is strengthening the one language that we have control over, which is English. So we help the students become strong in using the English language. Then there are many of you, especially those of you in rural Alaska, have dialectal English speakers in your classrooms, many, and they are not even identified as English language learners, which includes heritage language speakers and learners and bidialectal, including Native American, Native Alaskan languages. And this essentially means that they speak English, but their language is influenced by the home language, which might be Yupik or Inupiaq or Athabascan. And so they have language structures in the way they speak that stem from their native languages, but they don't speak the native language. But they could be learning the native language depending on if the school district has a dual language program or language nests. Like, for example, in Bethel, they've got a dual language program in Yupik. And then long-term English learners are those students who have come, example for these are a lot of the migrant Spanish-speaking students that come from Mexico who come and go. And so they never really develop a fully fluent capacity in English. And so they are continually identified as LEP or LEP. And they never really get out of that categorization. Another group of students this happens to are special ed students who are second language speakers. So this is something always to be in mind. And so the big picture in all this is how these students have access to academic oral language. They all need academic oral language in the content areas that you're teaching. And in your case, the oral language will be in English. So let's look at a few terms, and you can go to a great website called Colorín Colorado, which has wonderful information ideas for working with English language learners. So academic oral language development is what we're going to be looking at specifically. Academic oral language has to do with how we use the spoken word to convey the content we're teaching. So this isn't necessarily about writing, although writing might be a subsequent activity. It has to do with speaking and listening. So how are students engaged in speaking? How are they spoken to? How are they engaged in listening? What opportunities do they have to listen? What kind of listening opportunities do they have? ELL is a current term, or EL, as an English language learner, which would be a person learning English, not a person who is a native English speaker. ESL is the pedagogy. English as a second language is what we do, it's how we teach. That's just one way. Sheltered content instruction is another pedagogy. L1 native language, L2 second language, TL target language, SLA second language acquisition. Target language is whatever language you want to teach. So in our case, the target language is English. Second language acquisition in most cases is the second language anybody's learning. So if you were to go down to Mexico and start learning Spanish, it would be a second language acquisition situation. And Echeverria and Graves kind of outline a lot of what that looks like. We're going to look at it ourselves a little bit. But first, we're going to look at sheltered content instruction. So sheltered, if you imagine it, means like an umbrella. It's a protective measure which helps you do things, you do purposeful things to slow your instruction down or to make your instruction more specific. And in this particular case with the shadowing, we're looking at academic oral language. So it's a high quality process, develops students' academic English skills. It is used in sheltered content courses, which again, you know, is something that takes a little more explanation. It can be used in a variety of program models. Language is gained faster while learning content because language is contextualized and used in meaningful ways. This is probably the most important oval in this word web or this concept web. And then it integrates the standards and addresses the standards. So really what we're looking at when we're talking, my mouse is very sensitive, is that language is gained faster while learning content because the language is contextualized, which means it's made meaningful and comprehensible. And that's what you want to do with academic oral language, is make it meaningful and comprehensible. For our purposes, for the university, we are meeting, you can't see it on the top of this slide unfortunately, but the standards for initial TESOL pre-K-12 teacher preparation programs. So we're meeting standard 3, planning and implementing instruction, and through our activities, through our different classes with you, with working with English language learners, we're attempting to help you meet the standard, to plan supportive environments for ELLs, to design and implement standards-based instruction, to make your instruction ELL-centered with interactive approaches, and so forth. So you are planning, if you look at 3A, for culturally and linguistic relevant, you're creating them and promoting them, culturally and linguistically relevant classroom environments. You're designing your instruction in a scaffolded way. You are instructing ELLs using evidence-based, student-centered, and developmentally appropriate interactive approaches, which means you're just, it's what you would do with all of your students, but in particular, you're thinking about your ELLs in this particular instance. You adjust instructional decisions after you reflect on their learning outcomes in both language and content, which is why we have the language and content standards at the beginning of the lesson. You plan strategies to collaborate with other educators, and that fits in with the entire CAPE standards. And you adapt relevant materials and resources for ELLs to help to increase their access to the content that you're teaching. So what happens when they come into school if they don't speak English? When we are learning language, there are levels of language development that apply across the board to most language learners, whether they're learning a first language or a second language. We learn by listening first, and then our development is receptive, and then we start speaking 1 or 2 phrases, and then put phrases together to make more complex communication, and so on, until our conversation develops in a social way that we could have very advanced discussions. Academic language is pretty much the same way, because school is part of our developmental process. We begin at the school skills at the preschool level by following directions, learning cooperation and listening. We begin to decode and comprehend, and then beginning to write and start putting that writing together. And so these processes are relatively common or standard across, language learning. What happens is that if an ELL comes in and they've already gone through this process in their native language but don't have it in English, they're already at a disadvantage because they're going to have to do all these things that we've done since we were kindergartners, starting when they walk in the door. So they may have these skills in their native language, or maybe not if they're pre-literate, but they're going to have to spend time playing catch up all the time between the expectations for a native English speaker and where they are in their second language development, in their English language development. And so we have to find out where they fall on the continuum of language learning process in a systematic way. And we have many ways to do this. We assess native language when we can. We assess English language most often, like with the WIDA and the Access. We assess their ability with academics, which again, they may be coming in at a lower level because they received a lower level of instruction. And so we have to find out what they know and what they do. And then whatever learning and behavior challenges they have, which then leads into interventions and RTI and so forth. But the idea is that we have to give these students an extra leg up and consider that they have not had all that previous background instruction and experience in American schools or in public school. They haven't learned English to the level that the native language speaker is expected to speak. And so we have to pay attention not only to assessing what they know, but then how are we going to address what they know after we know. So after you've assessed students' skill with English language, we also are thinking of ourselves as language teachers and how important it is for us to have a good command of the structure and use of language in order to instruct students effectively. So phonology, morphology, and syntax with the sounds and the word parts and the grammar, those really don't change across levels. Listening, speaking, reading, and writing, when you're talking about academic language, are pretty standard. But when you get into different content areas, the pragmatics and the semantics, the function of the language and the meaning of the language changes because there is specific language to each content area. So even when you find out what a proficiency a student has in English, they may not have the proficiency in language arts that they do in math or social studies or science, depending on their own background knowledge and how accessible the language is to them, not just oral language, which we are talking about, but language in general. So language being a complex issue is something that we need to become aware of and transparent with so that we can teach students how to use language to learn, which is why we're trying. So we've looked at the uneven playing field that ELLs have when they come in to our schools. We've looked at how we try and assess them. We just addressed very quickly that we have ways to assess them. We've looked very quickly at the nature of what they have to learn in terms of access with the language and in terms of access to the content areas based on the different languages that content areas have. And then there are factors that affect second language acquisition just naturally. Students' motivation, their first language development, language distance and attitude. Language distance means how similar or different one language is to English in our case. Access to the language itself, which is what we're talking about. And then their age. When they're younger, they're more likely to be able to develop their a native-like fluency and proficiency, or native fluency and proficiency, whereas an older child, because their speech mechanisms are more solidified, may continue to have an accent for the rest of their life, and may not be able to hear particular sounds that we have in English because of the way that their physical body has developed and they've come in at an older age. Personality and learning style, peers and role models, quality of instruction and cultural background. All of these things are important factors, which each of them kind of bears their own discussion, but what we're really looking at today is access to the language. So two kinds of language that we kind of look at, and we want to remember that these are on a continuum, that it isn't just social language and it isn't just academic language, but this is a continuum. And on one side of the continuum is what we call basic interpersonal communicative skills. This is that social language that you saw on the cube. Language proficiency in context of social communication. It's less cognitively demanding. It requires face-to-face interaction. It uses extensive gestures and context, so you can learn and talk and communicate pretty comfortably in a language when you have strong social interpersonal skills. It could be deceiving, though. Okay, let me just finish this. Language is expressed through listening and speaking, rarely seen in print form, and first and second languages are in constant interaction. And interaction is really a key piece for any academic language learning. Interaction is one of the primary needs of second language learners. And I was going to say that cognitive academic language proficiency is kind of the other end of the continuum. So a child can speak social language, can learn to speak social language very well, or social English very well. And it deceives teachers into thinking that their academic language proficiency is also high, but that isn't necessarily the case. Because they haven't developed all those language pieces that we looked at earlier. Language proficiency related to academic setting is more intellectually demanding, is more abstract, and there's a time limit for clarification. Our classrooms, that pacing, bam, 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 we're going to get it done. And so the cognitive academic language proficiency that students have to develop really, really depends on their access to the language. How can we give them that access to the language? So we look at language as being, if you look at it contextual, it can be cognitively undemanding or easy. It can be cognitively demanding or difficult. This is also a continuum. It can be necessarily context embedded with lots of cues and clues and pictures, and it can be context reduced with very few clues and pictures. And I'll give you an example on the next slide. But if you think about the Bix and the Kelp, you'd see the social language would fit more here, and the academic language would fit more here. So we're trying to actually move students through the quadrants A, B, C, D, so that they can go from social language and use those as hooks to get to the more cognitively demanding language, which we want them to be able to use when they do, for example, the PEAKS assessments. So context embedded and cognitively undemanding, I said, is this social language. Students are actively negotiating meaning based on experience. And that isn't just kindergartners. That's 5th graders and 6th graders and 8th graders. Situational cues are present. Corrective feedback checks for understanding and interpersonal involvement is high. So that's the kind of language you can start with, and maybe you want to start with your ELLs. And then move them along the continuum to that context-reduced, cognitively demanding language where the material is more abstract and cues are linguistic only. Messages must be clarified and verified and varied in the absence of a shared reality in order to avoid misinterpretation. So you have to use a lot of clarification to understand what's being said. So one of the things in your protocol that you're going to be looking at is are the different kinds of language students have access to. And again, we're thinking about academic oral language. We're looking at how they take part in the language and how they listen to the language. So that's the speaking and the listening. So we're looking at speaking and listening in the context of these continua. Taking part in, let's look at interaction, which is on the left side of this quadrant session. So the top part, taking part in conversation at a party, at a bus stop, about weather, a chatty phone call to a friend, all fit in that social language that doesn't require a lot of thinking and has a lot of context to it. As you move down the quadrants, taking part in may be more cognitively demanding, requiring more thinking, more accurate and specific language that requires more description. So taking part in a conversation involving giving directions or instruction, a phone or inquiry about buying a computer would be examples of that kind of language that goes from cognitively demanding to cognitively undemanding, or vice versa. So in terms of listening, we'll look on the other side. So listening that's less cognitively demanding would be somebody recounting a personal anecdote or a story or a joke. There's still a little bit of reduced context there. This is showing the different quadrants. Whereas the most cognitively demanding in terms of listening to something would be the radio or TV news, a lecture, think teacher, and phone information. Like if you have to listen to instructions. So when you think of you, or like here I am talking head on this presentation, talking to your students, they have to do a lot of it. The ELLs have to do a lot of interpreting of what you're saying. They have to break down those phonemics and the morphemics and the syntax and the semantics while you're talking. So the idea is for academic oral language. Access to academic oral language means you've got to give them time to listen and time to take part in the conversation, that interaction. So there's interaction and there's listening. You also are thinking in terms of how you're presenting your material. This is something that's been around for a very long time, to move from the concrete, where there's like a bottle of water, you have the bottle of water, to symbolic, where you have a picture of a bottle of water, to the abstract, where you have the term H2O on the board, so that you move students along that continuum from cognitively undemanding and context embedded to that whole context reduced and cognitively demanding. So you think it's a scaffolding. This is scaffolding. You're scaffolding your students' language by giving them opportunities to interact and listen to the language that you're using. In your protocol, you're going to see these two categories: academic speaking, student to student, student to teacher, student to small group, student to whole class, student to student, teacher to student, teacher to small group, and teacher to whole class. So the arrows go different directions. As academic listening, are they taking part in a dialogue, or are they listening to a lecture? If so, who are they listening to? Are they listening mostly to other students, to the teacher, to small group, whole class, or not at all? So when you look at the protocol, and you'll see that in the instructions, you'll see how this is broken down. You're going to pay attention to how students are using oral language, the academic oral language in the classroom. So we talked about this being scaffolding. You are the scaffolder of information. You are taking the student from concrete to symbolic to abstract. I do, we do, you do, from very explicit instruction to independent work. All of this is all geared toward bringing ELLs up to an independent use of English, of language, and having equal access to the content that their native English speaker counterparts have. So we have done an extremely quick overview of sheltered instruction, but you will have read the book so we can have more of a conversation. We have become familiar with how language and sociocultural issues, we reviewed how context supports language and content learning, made the distinction between listening and speaking academic oral language, and using these concepts you will be using these concepts to inform your process of shadowing an ELL student. Your understanding of this presentation really does depend on you reading through the text that we've provided for you. And then we'll discuss the elements of second language learning as a group, complete the ELL shadowing observation protocol, and write up a reflection based on the protocol. So I look forward to some good questions and some good conversations regarding sheltered content instruction and academic oral language.